Hey, Wes, thank you for coming in. You've got an incredible history of accomplishment and contribution with some of the largest companies in the world, leading their divisions or being president of their top units. I mean, you name it, you've done it all, especially in biotech and healthcare. So just a remarkable background, and I can see why you've been tasked with leading now LabConnect on their next major journey, right? So thank you again for coming in and sharing your insights with my audience.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks, Stephen, for having me.
So, Wes, you got this remarkable track record over decades in just operational and leadership and management excellence. What would you say were the three inflection points in your life that led to where you are today? That could have been when you were 3 or 5 years old. It could have been something that happened in your family, outside the family. It could have been a paper route or something, an early job or mentors, maybe some of the first jobs you had that led to this remarkable career. So, can you point to maybe three major inflection points?
Sure. In fact, you mentioned paper route. So I wrote a book last year called The Turnaround Leader. And when I wrote the book, I thought to myself, what really was the start of my work ethic? And 'cause I don't think you're born with a work ethic. I think you have to be somehow triggered to do hard work and to get ahead. And so I think for me, it was my parents' divorce, to be honest. I was 12. My parents were divorced. I never really knew my dad very well growing up. My mom was a single mom for most of my upbringing, all the way through through high school. Um, and I got a paper route when I was 12, as a matter of fact, and that was my first job. And I wrote in the book that that was when I learned, to be responsible to the people. Back then, people actually read newspapers. Nobody that does that anymore, but newspapers was their lifeline to the world, and their coupons and the local news and national news. And so I felt it was a responsibility I took on very early on in my life. And that led to many other kinds of, I did everything I could to make money from 12 onward, including working in a hardware store for 4 years and managing a machine shop at my college at Worcester. I moved refrigerators and washing machines and dryers during my off months during college. Anything I could do to make money, and even back when I was 12, 13, shoveling driveways in the wintertime. I just think it was the trigger of my parents being divorced and my mom not having a lot of money and me being the oldest in the house to feel like I had responsibility to her and to my family. And I ended up raising all the money, pretty much all the money I needed for college. I went to a very expensive school. So it was a combination of a national direct loan, as well as scholarship, as well as hard work and money and whatever cash I could make in the summertime.
So I could see those being transformational. But what I'm hearing too then is, this inflection point of your parents splitting, and you're being the oldest, having to assume a lot of responsibility
Yeah.
and really have to create your own success. Just working to create your own path in some way, right? So you can be deterministic in that journey from your paper routes to hardware stores to getting scholarships. That requires hard work to be able to
Right.
gain the recognition. But you got the science kind of connectivity in all of your career milestones later on. So, were you like a math person when you were 5 years old and grade school and junior high into college, or healthcare was part of that? I mean, what were your interest points?
Well, I think the fact my dad was a naval architect and marine engineer, and so I kind of went down this path of thinking, yeah, very young, even though I didn't know my dad, didn't have a lot of interaction with him during those years. But he's a citizen of the world and a very smart man, and he went through in a master's degree at Michigan, and I always respected his his intellect and his knowledge of the world. And so I decided that engineering is probably my way forward, and it turns out that's the way I think. Engineers think in a very specific way. We think about life in linear terms. We think about life in logical terms. It's not as emotional as other types of jobs that you could have. And I think that suited me well. I mean, college, engineering college at Worcester Polytech was an important inflection point in my life because back then that school had a requirement that you had to not only do project work on site and off site, but also you had to pass a competency exam to graduate.
Yeah.
I think at the time, probably one of the only colleges undergraduate schools in the country that had such a requirement. Is like taking the bar exam for law school. And that getting through that was a huge, huge inflection for me. Uh, and then, of course, went on to get me a job at Exxon. I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd work for a company as large as Exxon. Uh, to answer your first question, which is, what are the three inflection points in your life? I'd say number two would be at Exxon, realizing that I was surrounded by very, very smart people, very smart engineers, people like me, and I'm just another one of them. But it was the hard work that got me to the very top of the ranks at Exxon. They had a ranking order every year. They would rank order everybody in the company, and that's how you were judged, and that's how you were paid. And for 10 years in a row, I was the top 10% of my class at Exxon. And that's when I realized that a little bit extra hard work and being amongst very smart people, you can get ahead.
Yeah, and I could see now you got your dad's DNA, even though he wasn't around. You got you got this engineering kind of bug in you, or this DNA sort of slant, and then you have all of this work ethic, and that can put you forward amongst others who are also very smart. You receive scholarships and things like that when you're in engineering school, and it's a good school. What kind of engineering did you study? And engineering, by the way, is very practical. It has that business element to it, right? So,
Yeah, I went in thinking I'd be a civil engineer because a lot of my friends were civil engineers, but it turned out that I was gravitating more towards mechanical. I told my dad I didn't really want to go into the boat business like he was in because I saw him struggle for most of his life in a very difficult market where the industry goes up and down, very cyclical. So I decided to go mechanical engineering, but then I focused on thermofluids, which is not the typical mechanical engineering you think about. I don't, not designing engines. I got into thermofluids and heat transfer, and my goal was to work for a company that built power plants. I ended up at Exxon building refineries instead.
yeah, and then through hard work, always distinguishing yourself, like you said, in the top 10%, and because they would rank order. By the way, that would create a lot of pressure as well, right? Because it's metrics driven, right? So you have to
Oh, very much so. It's a lot of fluid mechanics, by the way, is very empirical and not necessarily as much science as you might think. A lot of what I learned is that a lot of the data, a lot of the fluid mechanics and heat transfer techniques are all based on experimentation and data and historical data, as well as the steam tables, which we all had to memorize.
I can see that was so formative in what you're doing. So describe how you went from Exxon and being in the top leadership for years and years to eventually leading into biotech and
Yeah.
pharmaceuticals and things like that.
And that would probably go to the third and final trigger in my career. And I started out at I went from 12 years at Exxon building refineries, and it was a great experience. I lived overseas. I lived in Japan for 2 years building a refinery there. I lived in California for 5 years building an offshore facility and an onshore facility near Santa Barbara. It was probably the most important time in my life because we learned project management the way it's supposed to be done, and that really was a very very again a very engineering like linear relationship where project management is facts and data and observations and measurements and reporting, and that became the foundation for the rest of my life, to be honest. Because when I went to Glaxo on a whim, I decided to leave Exxon the year of the Valdez accident in 1989. It just spooked me a little bit that Exxon was on the wrong side of history at that point. Even though it was a great experience, and all my friends have since gotten through 40 years of in a pension. I left early because that year was a tough year to be part of Exxon. So I got a job offer from a very small company called Glaxo. They were just building a facility in North Carolina. And I came across the country with my 1-year-old son and my wife, and we decided to take a chance and work in the drug industry. Um, and so for basically 4 years or 5 years of my time at Glaxo, all I did was build facilities, lab facilities, power plants, drug development facilities, um, and their campus in Raleigh, Durham, which was a huge campus. They had 4,000 people at the time. Zantac was powering everything for Glaxo back then. But the third and final big trigger for me was when I decided that being an engineer in a drug company was not going to be my path to success. I mean, engineering in the drug industry is a necessary function. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that they're not at the top of the companies. At Exxon, if you're an engineer, you make it to the top. If you're an engineer in a drug company, you don't. So I got my MBA at night, and I got a chance to move into marketing. It was a complete. Somebody took a chance on me and moved me over to marketing, and that's when I decided that I was going to be a CEO someday.
Yeah, but you have all of the practical experience, right? We're understanding the processes and the workflow and the business, yeah, excuse me, strategy on the nuts and bolts of companies. And then you get into the business side, and that allows you to accelerate it on the other part, the customer facing, particularly,
Right.
and the revenue, the bottom line, and driving profits. And ultimately, that opens up the aperture for everything, right? So you,
Yeah, and
right?
the way I made the jump, and the reason they took a chance on me is because I had the engineering skills.
Right.
And there was a part of the marketing division that wasn't necessarily just marketing. It was marketing services. It was marketing research. It was forecasting and data management, and managing the conventions and symposia and all the doctor interactions. It was a very linear job, and so that's how they decided that they could take a chance on an engineer coming into marketing. It was a very novel concept back then, believe me, and not everybody bought into it. But over the next 2 years, I proved that engineers can make it marketing. And I got to learn from the very, very basics how to develop a drug, how to launch a drug. In fact, I was involved with probably 20 drug launches in my time there. Um, and that formed the basis for the rest of my career.
Yeah, and it's kind of like Jobs, right? Steve Jobs. I mean, he basically had an engineering background, but you really have to understand the customer and the market and how to take that whole life cycle from product all the way to selling it and marketing it, right? And
Well, and look at the beauty of the products that they make.
right,
I mean, engineers are not expected to think that way,
right.
but he had a very, very strong conviction that the product has to be beautiful, and he made that work, and he's certainly an icon now in history. But I think how I proved myself in that job was that I chose to develop a forecasting system that they had never invented before. Instead of listening to product managers who had these aspirational ideas about prescriptions being elevated to some level that would never happen, I had a very analytical approach to forecasting the drug side of the business, and that earned me a lot and got me to vice president of marketing. And then from there, back to manufacturing, but that's a whole nother story.
So how did technology play a part in your forecasting?
We we built um, we built a lot of algorithms that for different types of drugs that we were developing at the time, and we used a lot of historical data, not only from our internal systems but from external. And we would take attributes of the drug itself and the market size, the market growth rates, and apply the algorithm, which is basically a bell curve, to that drug. And so when we launched the drug, we knew roughly how it would grow. And once we had 12 to 18 months of history, we could certainly project the next 2 years. And so this became a very important staple at Glaxo back then. And people started really paying attention to uh, people other than product managers that were very optimistic.
So you're doing kind of predictive analytics. I guess this is prior to AI, though, right? So more
Oh, well before, yeah. We're talking 1980s.
yeah. But because you graduated into other companies and you could see the impact of biomedical innovation and the intersection with things like AI and so on. So can you talk about that journey from Glaxo to other companies and the roles you played, and then we'll finally terminate with LabConnect and what you hope to do there.
Yeah, sure. It's it's a weird, you don't plan these things, but the reason why I love marketing, I love the time in marketing, but we had a significant event at Glaxo where the UK government had, or the UK side of our business had largely ignored some of the the trends coming out of the FDA in the US. And so the FDA actually threatened to shut down imports into the US from the UK. And so they asked a few of us in marketing, my boss and I, to go back to manufacturing to see if we could fix it. And so we moved to England and we lived there for the next 4 years, basically transforming the Glaxo, which became GlaxoSmithKline ultimately, fixing the manufacturing network and the quality systems and the data management systems to be more in compliance with the FDA rules. And that's what got me into manufacturing in the drug business. And from there, I had an opportunity after 4 years, after living in the UK for a while with my family and uh, doing the GlaxoSmithKline merger of all 109 sites in something like 60 countries. I had an opportunity personally to be a CEO of a division of DSM, which is a Dutch company, a very big Dutch company. And they were looking for a CEO that could help transform their pharmaceutical division. They had a warning letter from the FDA that was threatening to shut the company down. I took the job again, a difficult one. It was a turnaround. First time I really appreciated the fact that turnarounds could be my thing. And so after 15 months, we were able to remove the warning letter with the FDA, satisfy all the requirements, put the company back into profitability. And then I got another call from a company called it was eventually called Valiant Pharmaceuticals to be president, working for my prior boss. And so I moved to California with my family, did that for 5 years, turned that company around, left that company to be a CEO of Patheon in Toronto. And I commuted to Toronto from California for a while to turn that company around. It was in a difficult situation. And I did that for 3 years, went through a hostile takeover by the minority investor. I mean, I'm not sure how much detail you want, but these opportunities came to me almost by chance and by reputation. And ultimately, you get a reputation for fixing companies that need help. So Valiant was one, DSM was one, Valiant was one, Patheon was one, and then from Patheon, I went to work for private equity for a little while, and then Markin, and ultimately UPS Healthcare, and now LabConnect.
And UPS Healthcare is a $10 billion business, so it's not a small unit, right?
So that's interesting because Markin was a very small courier company when I was offered the chance. It was a private equity held company by Apex Partners in London. Uh, I took the job. I'm not sure exactly why I took the job. It was a small logistics company, but they were determined to move into a new into the world and be a geographically full service clinical logistics company. I took the job, and 6 years later, I sold it to UPS. And along the way, we got through an insolvency period. The company was technically bankrupt for a little while. We had to turn the company over to its lenders at some point. We became a lender-led company. We put our debt holders on the board. We hired a new board chairman of the board. And, long story short, I mean, we put the company back into a significant situation in the industry. Became, in fact, today, Markin is the leading clinical logistics company in the industry. They're $1 billion business today. They were 150, 160 million when I took it. And we transformed the company from almost bankruptcy to the point where they're now the leading company in the world. UPS got We sold the company in 2016, at the end of 2016, and they asked me to stay for 3 years, which I did. I ran marketing as an independent division of UPS for those 3 years, and then my contract came up for renewal, and I said, no, I'm not going to stay. I'm going to go off and do something else. Jim Barber, the COO at the time of UPS, asked me if I would stay on. This was in early 2020. So I would stay on and help them build a division called healthcare because they loved the marketing story. And so I don't know, again, I'm not sure why I agreed, but I agreed. And a month later, 2 months later, COVID happened. And so here I am, president of UPS Healthcare, brand new division of the company. We're $4.5 billion in revenue if you took all the assets together. And for the next 2 years, I was embroiled in the whole Operation Warp Speed, working with the government, General Perna, moving vaccines around the world and trying to save the world. And we actually thought back then we were saving the world. We were trying our best to do what we could for the U.S. at first, and then eventually for 100 countries around the world, doing clinical trials, building facilities all over the world, building a cold chain that could handle vaccines, working with the African countries, working with a lot with Pfizer, a lot with Moderna, McKesson, all the key players. It was a huge, huge endeavor. And as you said, today, UPS Healthcare is a $10 billion division of UPS. And a year and a half ago, I left. I retired, technically retired. And here I am back in this chair again.
So in this journey then, because a big part of my audience are technologists, right? So and computer scientists and people like that, and engineers, what aspect of technology is being part of your journey and the types of technology that you've been able to kind of oversee, right?
I think it's a good question. I think a lot of my technology over these years has been around data management. I think because I'm an engineer, I think linearly. I think in terms of numbers and KPIs and metrics and algorithms. That's the way I think. And so every job I've had, including even back to Valiant days when we were developing drugs for Valiant, it's always been about the data. It's about putting the data into a structured format. And back then, we didn't have relational databases like we have now. We didn't have Microsoft Azure or Azure. We didn't have AI. Certainly didn't have AI at all. We didn't have Power BI or Tableau. But when I got to Marken, I discovered Tableau. And what a tool that was. That was, for me, transformational. To take the data that we had on 27,000 clinical trials, with all the data we had in terms of patient recruitment, deliveries, traffic lanes around the world, weather patterns, anything that impacted delivery of a drug sample could be put into a data warehouse back then, and then we put Tableau on top. And suddenly you realize the power of data you can lift data from any data source and put together a report that nobody else could do. And so for the next couple of years after I discovered Tableau, we used data to really sell new business and to show our clients that data really does matter. And since then, now we're using Power BI, even at LabConnect today, to take that same data we have available to us and use it to forecast your future, give clients the ability to mine your data, to find better places to recruit patients from, your success rates in terms of traffic lanes around the world, how weather and airlines can affect the time in transit, and how much time it has to take to get through customs, to look at hotspots around the world for patient recruitment and certain types of disease states. I think the answer to the question is it's all about the data. It's all about how you use the data. And I think we can still do a lot more. And now with the AI tools we have available to us, there's no limit.
So I just want to go into that kind of AI and some of the futuristic sort of tech, and then we'll sort of focus on LabConnect and what you're doing with LabConnect. So, there's kind of older AI and more statistically based, the machine learning platforms using older techniques, which are still required, especially in a highly regulated environments because you have to be certain that you're going to get reliable, repeatable results, right? But then there's this LLM kind of journey coming in and a lot of attention to it, things like co-pilots and digital assistants and so where do you see that going? Do you think that the LLMs, the chat GPT kind of technologies, and now there's reasoning that and there's a talk of AGI. And because you're an engineer, you're probably very grounded. Like I find when I talk to European leaders, they don't want to go to AGI right now. They're thinking that's maybe a little bit too esoteric. So where do you sit? Because you're American, so you're leading in these areas, and you heard of the Stargate $500 billion infrastructure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's big.
Taiwan Semiconductor doing 165 billion investment in the U.S. So where do you see all of this?
Well, let me. I was recently in a conference with one of our private equity owners, and they asked the same question. Yeah, the trouble with the pharmaceutical industry is we're very, very old-fashioned. It's a very old-fashioned, very reluctant to change industry. Um, the fact that the FDA, we're heavily regulated, of course, that making a drug, for example, and even developing a drug is reliant on a very specific process, a very step by step. Let's talk about drug development first. I mean, you've got an idea. You've got to figure out whether you've got a safe product. So you have to do preclinical studies first. Then you put the drug into animals. You prove the drug can be possibly safe in healthy humans. And you put it into phase 1 trial where you have healthy humans, volunteers, and proves that the drug will not hurt anybody, people. And then from there, you have to start thinking about efficacy. So you're now talking about real patients that have real disease, and you have to study that in patients to see if you get a response. And then from there, you have to optimize the dose. So there's another phase of phase 2, phase 2B. You optimize the dose, then you go from there to your pivotal study. All these steps are required. And there's really little you can do to improve the process unless you start taking a leap of faith with AI, for example. So there is now a concept that you can develop a drug with AI tools by using a digital twin approach. So you can actually simulate what a drug might do based on all the wealth of data that's available in the world on the internet. And so there are companies now that are doing early drug development using AI tools. And I think there is a possibility there. And it's really a good thing for us. On the manufacturing side, however, again, it's very, very highly regulated. The FDA has very specific rules for how you make drugs. You have to have reproducible batches. You have to make sure you prove to yourself and to them that you can reproducibly produce the same drug the same time every time. And there's very little you can do with AI to prove that. You just have to do it. You have to make the drug 3 times in a large scale batch, perhaps. And so I think we're all scratching our head on the manufacturing side, how we use AI tools. Aside from, writing reports, we can write reports with ChatGPT. We can write reports with Perplexity. We can use those tools for simple things like medical writing, technical writing. But the actual improvement in how we develop and manufacture a drug, I think the industry is still scratching their heads on this a little bit. But I have hope that we'll find, easier and faster ways to make things in the future.
I guess you could use it for drug discovery, like, amino acids molded into proteins and doing protein synthesis and things like that. And that's on the discovery side. But I guess
discovery, yeah.
But on the manufacturing, that's that challenge, right? So
yes, it is. It is.
How about the use of robotics in manufacturing? And there's this a lot of money going into robotics, and this kind of embodiment of AI into robotics. Do you see any role in robotics into manufacturing at all, or no? Or too early, maybe?
Well, I think so. I mean, I've seen there's a lot of a lot of new drugs these days are oncology based drugs, cancer based therapies, and most of the cancer therapies today are sterile either sterile biologics or sterile small molecules. Sterile drugs are very difficult to make. You have a lot of potential for contamination if you have humans around. So a lot of the old-fashioned sterile facilities required a lot of air handling, a lot of air movement, a lot of particulate testing, microbial testing to make sure you're not contaminating a sterile drug when the vial is open, when the vial is being filled. And so that led to isolation technology where you now can put the whole process inside of a smaller area called an isolator, and you basically use hand gloves to get in and manipulate things if you have to. And that was probably the first step in automating manufacture of sterile drugs on the secondary side. The primary side is still very chemically oriented with fermenters and big reactors. But on the secondary side, it's isolators became probably the first big step forward. And now there's more and more robotics being built into the isolators. So more and more of the management of the manipulation of the vials and the ampules and the self-injectors are all being done with robotics inside these isolators. So more and more of that is being automated. Packaging technology has gone a long way in terms of robotics. So you'll see a lot of packaging done without human interaction at all.
You saw Microsoft release their Majorana chip using a sort of quasi-particle topological quantum state. You saw Google release their Willow chip, which they claim it can, in an hour or a few minutes, do something that would take a classical supercomputer 10 septillion years. That's 10 to the 24 zeros. You have Quantinuum doing all sorts of things. IonQ, you have PsiQuantum. DARPA just released the finalists for they have a project, which is kind of like a utility project. And their two finalists are Microsoft and PsiQuantum. And PsiQuantum is predicting having 1 million qubits by 2027 using their photonic system. So there seems to be a bit of an acceleration. And I just did a conversation with Bronson, he's it's kind of like the scientific director of Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and they have the first exascale supercomputer, and they work with quantum people as well. And he talks about openly that, supercomputing, quantum, Microsoft has this thing called quantum elements, so you can subscribe to it in the cloud where you're combining quantum, supercomputing, AI, machine learning. This can be used in all sorts of fashions that could impinge on healthcare, from drug discovery to new materials to simulations, as you mentioned, logistics amplification or optimization. In your opinion, are some of the things that you were doing looking at maybe quantum, or at least sort of poking at it?
Not yet. It's a little bit beyond my way of thinking at the moment. I think we all are looking at better ways to use the information we have.
Right.
In the lab business, which is where I am now, I mean, we have a treasure trove of data that we can use for predicting better how patients can be recruited into a study, predicting compliance rates, for example, predicting dropout rates, predicting error rates in sample technology. We are collecting, our job now at LabConnect is to collect human blood, and turn that into data. And 80% of the data used for filing a new drug application comes from the central lab. That's the company that I run today. So we're trying to find better ways to predict for rare diseases, for example, where you can find patients that satisfy the protocol that's been developed by the sponsor company. And I think that's where AI will play a big part in what I do today, is looking at how we can use the data we have from all various historical drug trials that we've been involved with, and find better ways to help recruit patients, keep them on drug, keep them compliant, and make sure that the data that comes through with the blood samples and the urine samples and the whatever plasma we're collecting is accurate and usable in the filing of the drug.
Okay, so that's a great segue, right? Because that's where you ended up. So you retired and then you come out of retirement to do LabConnect. Why did you do that when
Yeah,
it's great history of success? You somebody pulls
yeah.
you in, right? So how did that happen?
It's a good question. As much as I love UPS, it wasn't for me. It's a very big company. I feel like I thrive much better either running a smaller company or being involved with smaller companies. I as much as I enjoyed my time at UPS and I'm very proud of what we built there. Probably the world's leading cold chain in the world now, maybe second to DHL, perhaps, maybe a little bit ahead of DHL, but it was a good run for me. But then I did retire, and I thought that my end game would be working for private equity and being on boards, which is what I did for a year and a half. I worked for several private equity firms, big ones. I worked on many diligence projects, and I became chairman of the board of a company in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm on three international boards now: one in Sweden, one in Germany, one in Dublin. A very nice portfolio of companies that I'm involved with, and I love it. It's fine, but it's not the same as running a company. It's just not the same. When you're on a board, you have a lot of responsibility, especially if you're public, but you're not in the chair. You're not driving the results, and that's what I love. So after a year and a half or so, I got a call from the people that own LabConnect, and they were asking me for some advice on an employee that they were trying to hire. And I turned out that it was kind of a ruse because they were really interviewing me for the CEO job. And sure enough, a few weeks later, they called me back and made me an offer. So the reason I joined is because, first of all, I know the company. I know the founders. They were a client of mine for many years at Markin. The board wanted me to make transformational change. So this is a nice turnaround opportunity. They allowed me to move the company to Raleigh, Durham, which I'll do. The company has no debt. It's cash generating. It's a profitable business, and they only have 3.5% market share in a growing market, and the ability to grow internationally. And something I've done for 43 years. I've worked for international companies. I really love it. I feel like I'm a citizen of the world, and LabConnect has a great opportunity to move internationally into Europe and Asia and Latin America and parts of China and South Africa, South Korea. So all those reasons kind of boiled together and just seemed like a natural thing for me to do. I know the industry well. A lot of the clinical research organizations, what we call CROs, are based here in Raleigh. Uh, Over the years, I've gotten to know a lot of the CEOs of these companies, and it just seemed like a natural move for me. And it just came out of the blue, and so here I am, back in the chair again.
So what's the value proposition of LabConnect? Why are you better than what's out there? And how can you grow it to being that that lion's share of market share?
Well, I think we're pretty unique because we're very much like Markin. Markin was an asset light, courier company that became a powerhouse clinical logistics provider. We at Markin, we didn't actually own any vehicles. We contracted with couriers around the world, and we connected the dots. Ultimately, connecting the dots to the UPS airline, which made us very, very special. But being an asset light company is interesting because you don't have the burden of maintenance and whether you're paying people on a W-2 basis or you're paying them on a 1099 basis, you don't have all that headache. You don't have the drivers; they don't work for you. The same thing is at LabConnect. We are an asset light lab company. We don't own any labs. We contract with labs around the world. So we're agnostic when it comes to lab selection, and any of our clients that have a preferred lab because of the assays that they offer, we can do that. So we partner with 7 big regional labs around the world to cover the whole world. And we have 60 other labs that we work with for esoteric testing, DNA testing, specialty testing. And so we can put together dissimilar lab data into a single file and provide that file to our clients in a way that nobody else can. And so we really believe that we're unique in that way. We can take dissimilar data from different labs put it into a common format, and deliver that in one file. And that is a big differentiator for us. So we're independent. We're not connected to a lab. We can use any lab we like. We can consolidate the data into one file. We work with Markin as the leading clinical logistics provider in the world. So we have one of the best couriers that we have in the world. And we have a very unique stake amongst those clinical research organizations that don't have labs. There are several that don't have labs at all, and we become their partner. So those are the main differentiators we have. We believe we're probably faster than most. We can get trials started within 6 to 8 weeks instead of 16 weeks. And we believe we're pretty nimble. We can operate pretty much anywhere we want. We can set up a facility anywhere we want. And we're not tied to any specific infrastructure anywhere at the moment.
Yeah, and then Wes, you're a differentiator as well, because you've got a great background for this.
Well, I have to say we do have some. I mean, I'm still on a non solicitation with UPS, so I'm not able to bring some of my team over from there. But I will say that I know a lot of folks in the industry, and we have the opportunity to bring in some really good talent, and we will do that.
So what's your, I mean, a lot of this will be kind of proprietary or private, but how do you plan to scale or continue to grow LabConnect to have a larger market share? You talked about some of your differentiators, so you would have a strategy to execute on that, right?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I sorry about the dog in the background. I have a new puppy. The company started out working for small biotech firms that didn't want to necessarily work with the big labs, where they would become a very small fish in the very big ocean. So the company was started on the basis of working with just the biotech firms, smaller firms, and their average size of their contract would be somewhere in $100,000 to $200,000 for a trial. We've now since decided that we really need to expand beyond that and work with the CROs, the big central and global research companies that have big contracts with the pharma companies. And so a big part of our growth will be working with them. These are the CROs that don't have labs. And there's many of them here in the Triangle in Raleigh-Durham. That's the second segment. And the third segment is to actually break into pharma. There's a lot of big pharma sponsors, have their favorite labs, and we'd like to be at least their first or second choice. Almost every pharmaceutical company from Pfizer to Novartis to GlaxoSmithKline have long-term 5-year contracts with central lab providers like us. And we have not broken into that market. That we've just not been seen as big enough. We've not been seen as geographically diverse enough. And so by building, a big part of our expansion is to build a facility of our own in every one of our 7 key regions. So starting with the US and Europe, we have a facility in Cologne, Germany. We have a facility in Melbourne, Australia, to serve the Oceania market. We will build something in Shanghai to serve China. A small facility in South Korea, which is a very, very fast-growing area, by the way, for clinical trials. South Korea, a big change in the last 5 years. Believe it or not, Africa is a big source of clinical trial patients as well, especially for rare diseases. And the central location for Africa is South Africa. So we'll build something in South Africa near Johannesburg. And we'll build a small facility in Miami to serve Latin America. And so those are the 7 major regions, I think 7, that will serve the globe. And we'll have our facility next to our lab partner. So we become the place where we bring the samples in, accession the samples, get the samples tested, assimilate the data, deliver the data to the client, including making our sample kits. So we will provide a full service from each one of our locations. And that makes us equivalent to almost any other central lab in the industry. Now suddenly we can do phase 3 trials, we can do global trials, we can work with pharmaceutical companies of any size. And we become a much more credible global company. And I think that's probably the first best way to answer your question.
Yeah, you're going to be agile. You're going to have full service. You're going to remove all the friction in the system. and you're the center driving this. So that's a great opportunity as well, right?
Yeah, and we're putting a lot of money in this year to build a new laboratory information system. We call it LIMS, a new ERP system. We'll be using Microsoft Dynamics for that. We're building a new sample tracking system of our own, and we're maximizing our use of Salesforce to finally digitize the company to the point where we can really be scalable. One of the barriers we've had over the years is we're pretty manual in the way we work. This will help us to be really much more automated and digitized.
Yeah, and then Wes, with your background, you're the perfect CEO of this company.
Nobody's perfect,
Well,
but thank you.
close to perfect as possible, though. I mean, your background is such a great fit. So,
It's been fun so far. I think building a team is really the current challenge because not everybody's suited for this kind of change. There are people that just don't like change, and so we'll be building out our team, becoming more international. More to come, but I'm 4 months in, and we're still working on it.
and then this will be your last major role, and then you will finally retire, or no?
Yeah, well, I tried to launch into boat building, and we actually built a couple of boats ourselves, my wife and I. That could be something we do in retirement. Uh, and who knows? If something comes along that makes sense. I do like to work. I don't think I could play golf and fish for the rest of my life. I think I need something more purposeful than that.
And it started with the paper route.
And it's all center of the paper. That's right.
They were
Yeah.
working in hardware stores and things like that, right? So,
Yeah. It's funny you asked that question because that's how I started the book that I just wrote. Is it all starts with a paper route? Your first job. Your first job's important.
is your book handy so you can put it up to the camera so people can
Yeah.
see?
Yeah, it's actually available. I'm not sure if you can see that. Um, Called it the Turnaround Leader,
Well, you're definitely the turnaround leader.
and it's available on Amazon.
Yeah, and it's real, right? Because you've done it and
It's a real
everything. Yeah.
physical book. I'm finding out though, that I have a lot of physical books here that people just like to read things online. So you just download the book and you can read it that way. It's funny how many people have come interested in working for us that have already read the book, and I find that it's very nice of them to say that.
So, Wes, this is the very last question, and that is, what are your recommendations to the audience and/or questions you want to leave the audience?
I'm actually writing a second book now called Stuff, and it's just stuff I've learned over the years that nobody actually tells you when you're growing up unless you've got uh, some way to get that information. You just learn by example. You learn by making mistakes, and one of the sub chapters in there is you may be able to outthink me, but you will never outwork me.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to train my kids over the years is that not everybody wants to do the hard work. Most people that you run across are very happy to have a 9 to 5 job, do their job, do what they're asked to do, don't go out of the way, don't do anything special. But those people that do those things, they get ahead. And so it's not about being the smartest guy in the room. It's about being the guy or the gal that's willing to step out and do something different. I mean, at Exxon, I made it a point to be different just by working hard, doing the jobs that nobody else wanted to do, volunteering for things. I think that's my best advice to anybody when they start out in their career and they want to make a difference. I mean, you're amongst a lot of smart people, but it's not always the smartest person that gets ahead. It's the one that decides to step out and do something unique.
Yeah, and you definitely have to have a certain level of optimism, confidence, hard work, agility, perseverance, persistence, all of those things, right? So, and then you have a lot of talent as well. So when you combine that, that's an unstoppable.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So, Wes, thank you for coming in. I really enjoyed this conversation with you. You gave some really practical advice, and you described your journey, and throughout that is constant change, but innovating on that change and execution. So, you got to act, and you've
Yep.
acted, executed throughout. So, I wish you much success with LabConnect, and I'm going to follow what you're doing. So thank you again.
Stephen, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. It's been very good. Have a great weekend.
You too as well.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.